alluded to at the end of the last video on stress, it's really important to understand the impact that stress has on our health because there is substantial research on it. But understanding stress helps give us insight on how we can cope with it. All is not lost just because you're experiencing a lot of stressful circumstances in your life, doesn't mean that there's not more healthy and adaptive ways to cope with that stress, and in doing so, be a healthier person and manage the effect that stress has on your life. So, plenty is within your control to try and manage the way that you respond to stress to help manage and promote your own health. So, coping is basically just how you deal with your stressful events. And there's different strategies that you can take depending on the circumstances. So, one version of coping is what we call problem focused coping. So, this is when you try and address your stressful situation directly. So, if, for example, your stressful event is coming up against a difficult exam that you are really worried about and that's stressing you out, the problem focused approach would be to say to yourself, I'm going to study as hard as I can, and I'm going to do everything within my power to make sure that I've practiced for the exam, I've done practice problems, and I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to address this problem by succeeding at this exam. So, this is obviously going to be an approach that's great if you do, in fact, have a stressor that you can solve by addressing it directly. It's not always the perfect approach, though. Just being problem focused is not necessarily always the 100% correct approach. Sometimes, if it's a problem that's difficult to change, something that's kind of without of your control to actually actively change, trying to have this problem focused approach might ultimately frustrate you. And you might actually end up feeling more distressed in the long run because you're not paying attention to managing your emotional reactions. You're just trying to address an inherently unsolvable problem. So, if it's a problem that can be addressed and fixed, problem focused is great. But if it's something that is somewhat out of your hands, trying to take this approach might ultimately frustrate you. So, the flip side to your problem focused approach is going to be your emotion focused approach. So, this is when you try merely to manage the emotional impact of your stress. So, trying to manage your emotions. So, this is going to be an approach that is ideal when you ultimately have a problem that you can't solve. So, for example, this pandemic, this is something that's basically out of our hands to directly solve. One thing that we can all focus on is trying to look after our emotions, trying to make sure that we're managing our negative feelings by maybe giving ourselves something more positive to focus on. And in doing so, we can't solve the bigger problem, but we can at least try and address the problem of the way we're feeling. We do have a command over our emotions, and we can actively try and reduce negative feelings with certain coping strategies that focus on redirecting your emotions. So, if it's a problem that's out of your hands to directly solve, focusing on the emotional aspect would be healthy. But if you over highlight the emotional aspect when there are things you can actively do to affect the problem, right? More so dealing with the emotional aspect can get you to ignore the bigger problem that you can solve. So I would say a healthy coping strategy is overall going to be targeted to whatever the situation entails and maybe using a little bit of both as appropriate. So again, for example, with this COVID-19, there are some problems that we can actively solve, right? We can wash our hands, we can disinfect surfaces, we can wear masks to try and protect ourselves and other people. But not all of the problems can we solve ourselves, so we should also make sure that we're thinking about managing our emotions. So there is going to be a certain targeting whereby you do want to make sure that you're thinking about which strategy is the most adaptive, and you can go a little bit column A, a little bit column B. You can focus on both to the extent that it helps you. So, one important factor in trying to address problems actively, so engaging that problem focused coping approach, is whether or not you perceive certain outcomes to be within your control. Even as I just alluded to, you can refocus your problems to think about what you do have control over versus what you don't have control over. So, to feel like you do have some control is important in engaging this typically quite adaptive problem-focused coping approach. So this increase of perceived control is important. Research on level of control and its impact on resilience has indicated that taking control away greatly exacerbates the detrimental effect of stressful experiences. So, for example, some rat studies in which rats were subjected to electric shocks. Obviously, that's a distressing and stressful experience. Rats who were unable to turn off the shocks for other rats found that they had an increased level of, in this case, ulcers. So this was a health outcome that I didn't mention in the last video. There's been substantial research on the relationship between stress and ulcers. There does appear to be somewhat of a connection, maybe mediated through an increase of unhealthy bacteria that lead to ulcers. But either way, it was found that when you, to the greatest extent possible, took control away from the rat, you exacerbated their likelihood of experiencing the health outcome of ulcers. So you can imagine that the same would be true of humans, that taking things out of their control is going to take that problem focused coping approach away from them. And the research would indicate, if we do try and apply this to humans, that it might exacerbate health outcomes. Again, rats and humans aren't exactly the same, so you do have to take that finding with a grain of salt, but enough research indicates that control is important for non human animals and humans alike. So, this lack of control condition did in fact tend to lead to a heightened amount of the stress hormone of cortisol, which I mentioned is highly likely to be an important pathway between the stress response and health outcomes, as well as other factors like increased heart rate, which can ultimately lead to heart disease down the line. So experiencing chronic lack of control can lead to a really dire outcome of what we call learned helplessness. So if any human or non human animal experiences a series of events in which we have no control over our fate, that can ultimately lead to a lot of long term damage. So, if we find time and time again that we don't have control over our fate, it'll cause us to give up more easily when we encounter difficulties going forward. So, overall, to experience this learned helplessness leads to overall negative health outcomes. Chris is home. Okay, so having one bad event out of your control obviously doesn't feel good, but to actually cause someone to feel like they don't have any control over anything, this can lead to this learned helplessness outcome, which is very detrimental to your health and well being long term. Studies on learned helplessness in animals found that inducing learned helplessness in a non human animal increases their mortality rate. It causes them to die earlier. So, this is obviously a really dangerous outcome for someone to experience this learned helplessness. So, some really great research among older individuals found that giving people back some measure of control can help alleviate this experience of learned helplessness. So, for example, in elderly individuals in a nursing home, one experiment found that merely giving these individuals a plant to take care of helped reduce this feeling of helplessness and helped induce an increased feeling of control. So, if you even have a plant that you need to take care of, or an animal that you need to take care of, right? The idea is that you get some measure of control back, and this is great for helping reduce the extent to which you feel like you're helpless. So, this leads to a concept of what we call your loci of control. Loci is just the plural of locus, meaning source of. So, research has identified an important difference between where people think control in their life comes from. So, when someone has what we call an external locus of control, they believe that basically their fate is out of their hands, that outside sources entirely control what's going to happen to them. It's always about, why did this happen to me? Why did this person do that to me? And thinking that things just happen to you and you really can't help it. So, this is obviously going to be a psychological experience that greatly leads to this feeling of helplessness. If you feel like your life is sort of out of your hands and things just happen to you, but to have an internal locus of control, to believe that the capability to shape your fate exists internally, tends to be associated with more positive outcomes. So if you feel like you have some measure of control within yourself to help shape the outcomes that you experience, this tends to have a lot of positive health and psychological benefits. So, this self control factor relates to the idea of feeling like you have control over what happens to you and what you do. So, self control is basically the idea that you believe you have the capability within yourself to control your actions, to control your impulses, and, for example, delay gratification. So, really cool research on delay of gratification has found that children who are able to delay gratification of being able to eat a tasty marshmallow by waiting a little while to then get two marshmallows as a reward, kids who are more adequately able to complete that self control task tend to have better health and life outcomes down the line. So, if somebody does not possess a lot of self control, the idea is that they might think that the locus of control for their actions are sort of outside of them. So that external like locus of control that tends to not be positively associated with health and well being. So, to try and increase the extent to which you have self control and can delay gratification, or to just naturally possess this capability, again, it tends to go hand in hand with these loci of control and ultimately feeling like you have control and are not helpless. So, one personality characteristic that goes hand in hand with the ones I've mentioned is the notion of optimism. So, your outlook on life to a certain extent is something that you can control. So, we probably all know someone in our lives who's like a perennial optimist. They always see the best in every situation, they always seem to be able to see a bright side. Um, to a certain extent, this is something that some people have and some people don't. But the research indicates that to be optimistic is definitely associated with better health and longevity long term. And likely this is partially because of the increased feelings of control that optimists have. So, again, some people tend to be more optimistic and some people don't, but given that there is this correlation between optimism and health and well being, maybe trying to cultivate a little bit more optimism in your life, maybe by reframing, reappraising the issues in your life, can help you promote your own health and well being. So, a really cool study that used actually content analysis, so the types of words used in letters written by Catholic nuns over a series of many years, found that nuns that included more optimistic language in their letters tended to live years and years longer. So, really interesting little case study there. Again, some of us are naturally inclined towards optimism. Me, I don't feel like I naturally possess that inclination, but I try and cultivate it in my life the best that I can. You sort of fake it until you make it. Try and verbalize a more optimistic outlook and see if it can eventually start to feel more true and the words feel more sincere when you say them. So it's worth a try. Try being a little bit more glass half full of a person. Another critically important avenue through which we can promote our own health and well being is by highlighting the relationship that social support, affiliation, and relationships has with our health and well being. If you remember back to the need to belong theory, social psychology states in the need to belong theory that the need to be a social creature and to have meaningful relationships is akin to any of our other physical needs. So, obviously, to have a sense of social support and to have meaningful, close relationships is of great importance for our psychological health and well being and actually our physical health and well being. Individuals who have meaningful close relationships tends to predict longer life and better health over the course of time. And it tends to be associated with diminished stress hormones as well, which again, as we've identified, likely is the pathway through which stress impacts health in a detrimental way. So, another important avenue to help promote health is to help highlight the importance of social relationships. So, encouraging people to make and forge meaningful relationships and giving them the opportunity to do so. Whenever we're experiencing stress, to let ourselves reach out and rely on our friends and our loved ones. This is something that is so important to help promote your health in times of stress. You don't necessarily need a huge group of friends for there to be important social support in your relationship. Having some close others in your life, having that feeling of strong social support is vastly important to your health and well being. Another factor that's definitely linked to health and well being is just exercising. So, even though it might seem really hard when you're experiencing a lot of stress or a lot of difficulties, going to the gym might be the last thing on your mind. There's a lot of research that if you can just get yourself to do it, get your body moving in whatever way is fun for you, this can have the immediate effect of making you more energetic and boosting your mood and making you happier. So, even if it's hard to get yourself to do it, even getting yourself to do something as simple as take a walk can have this immediate boosting effect. Additionally, there's some really cool research that finds that physical activity actually triggers changing genomic expression that tends to activate the production of proteins that can guard against certain chronic diseases long term. So, exercise can actually change you on a genetic level to promote health and well being. So, again, even if it's hard to force yourself to do it, just getting yourself to try and exercise in some way that's fun for you can do a lot to improve your health and well being throughout your lifetime. Okay, so lots of research has tried to pinpoint just how exercise is associated with mental health outcomes. Again, taking the instance of depression or anxiety, if anyone's ever talked to a mental health counselor to get help for depression or anxiety, one piece of advice they'll give you is to get out and exercise. So, again, this might be the last thing that you want to do when you're feeling depressed, but research has affirmatively shown that exercise can help improve depression outcomes. As we'll talk about, when we talk about psychological disorders, experiencing depression is detrimental to your health and well being and longevity. So, the idea is if exercise can help improve depression outcomes, maybe it can help improve health outcomes through that pathway. And research does, in fact, find this to be the case. That among, at least in this case, among the mildly depressed, an exercise induction and being part of an exercise treatment group can help reduce depression symptoms. Now, whether or not this would translate to people who are severely depressed, I would say that link has not necessarily been shown to be true. But definitely going through a period of depression, trying to get yourself to exercise a little bit can definitely be beneficial to your long term outcomes. Another way that you can try and cope with stress and improve your health is to try and change up some factors in your lifestyle. So, one thing, perceiving that you have the ability to control factors in your lifestyle and that you can make positive changes. You do see that people who are able to enact lifestyle modification can improve the effect of stress on their health. So, people who are encouraged to change their diet for the positive, to exercise more, and engage in other sorts of lifestyle modifications like slowing down the pace of your life. So, trying to reduce the extent that stressors are forcing you to go a million miles a minute, to accept problems and imperfections. So, changes to your lifestyle in terms of diet and exercise, etc., as well as changes to your perspective on life, these all definitely can help improve health and well being. So, giving people the tools and advice to help change their lifestyle can definitely reduce the extent that stress has negative health outcomes. Research on meditation has found that this is a great way to try and promote relaxation and reduce stress. So it takes a little bit of getting used to be able to meditate properly. Me personally, I've never really had the ability to really turn my mind off and properly meditate. It's definitely a skill that takes practice. And the research indicates that if it's something you're interested in, it can definitely promote health. To meditate and to sort of focus on the here and now and try and clear your mind of all the excess and the external world, you definitely see the physical consequences of stress diminished. So, physical relaxation, blood pressure and heart rate slowing down and lowering. It definitely appears that these changes can help boost people's physical health. So, for example, it can help with your sleep. So, trying to practice the skill of meditation can be something that can help reduce insomnia, which will obviously be able to boost your health and diminish your stress. Additionally, there's really cool brain changes that have been identified for individuals that engage in meditation. So there's brain areas that tend to become active when we're successfully regulating our emotions, which, as I mentioned, is one strategy for coping with stress. So if meditation is helping promote brain activity in these areas, this might help promote your capability to regulate your emotions. Another interesting bit of research has found a pretty strong relationship between religiosity and health, surprising as it may be. Now, there's a variety of pathways that can help explain this relationship, but basically, the research has established that there is a pretty strong relationship between being religious and being more healthy. It might not be the case that being a religious person who attends religious services is directly tied to health outcomes. It might be the case that attending these religious services is just encouraging you to engage in other healthy practices. So, if you think about what tends to go along with religious attendance, it promotes social connections. So, the people from your religious group are definitely an important social circle. And as mentioned, social support is so important for health and longevity. So that might be one pathway that religiosity can help improve health. It might be that religiosity promotes engaging in healthier behaviors. So, for example, a lot of religious groups discourage alcohol or even caffeine usage. So, being a religious person may have the downstream consequence of helping promote your engaging in healthy behaviors. A lot of people report that religious attendance, if that's something that's important to them, helps boost their mood and increases their positive emotions. So, again, feeling good and boosting your mood can help reduce your level of stress. So, through all of these three pathways, we can help explain why religious attendance tends to be associated with health. The idea here is that you don't need to become religious if you aren't already to improve your health. By understanding the pathways through which religion can lead to healthier outcomes, we could engage in any of these behaviors ourselves to try and increase our health, even without attending a religious service if that's not something you're naturally inclined to do. So, this is something we'd term an indirect effect. I've mentioned several times throughout these lectures the idea of pathways or mediation. Those are all other ways of saying there's what we call an indirect effect. So, this is the idea that certain variables may be related only through another mechanistic pathway, right? So I mentioned that religious involvement tends to boost social affiliation, and it's social affiliation that might be more directly related to health. This is what we call an indirect pathway. It's not the religious involvement directly that's likely boosting health, it's through the indirect pathways of other variables that religious involvement boosts, and those factors more directly boost health. So, this is the basic set of theories related to these indirect pathways through which religion tends to be associated with better health. Again, the idea is there is this correlation between religion and health. By better understanding why that relationship is there, by identifying the pathways, we get a better sense of what leads to healthy outcomes so that any individual can promote their own health and well being. Okay, so that'll do it on the lecture on coping with stress and promoting your own health. I'll pick back up with psychological disorders next time.